Hello, friends of Studio Brûlé. This is Steve Brûlé, and it is coffee time where we go over some of the things that come across our desks in the last couple of days. And we have special guest Janice Aug with us today to get into more details about what's going on at the crazy universities where freedom of speech is punished today. It's absolutely out of control. There's no question about it. I'll draw your attention to my VIP club membership of the patriarchy, which authorizes us to discuss all the evil comings and goings of the evil feminist empire that has thousands of tentacles spread all over the world. And before we get into the depth of this topic, I just want to make an announcement. There's an upcoming 21 convention in Orlando, Florida. The date is here on your screen, October 1st to 4th, 2020 in Orlando, Florida. And speakers are talking about men's issues in this particular convention, and there's a sister convention about I think Anthony calls it "Make Women Great Again." I wanted to point this out because I'll be speaking at the convention, the 21 convention, on the first day of the event, I believe it is. I'm not 100% sure of the timing, but I think it's the first day. So if you're interested, you can. I recommend that you check out the website at the very least and sign up for the convention. Here is the URL for the website where you can find lots more information about this. And over here you have the Twitter connection for 21 Studios and the 2020-21 convention. So with no further ado, let's get right to the meat of the topic with Janice Aug, who needs no introduction here.
Hey, hi, Steve. How are you doing?
Hey, Janice. Great to have you back on the coffee session.
Yeah, good to have you doing your coffee sessions again. I had missed them.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's always stuff to talk about, that's for sure. And this is a good example.
This is an excellent example.
You know, it's a shocking example. If it were a one-off, if this were truly a crazy person, one could perhaps even feel a bit sorry for her and not regard it as particularly important. But unfortunately, what she is articulating here in her course syllabus or course outline is what I think it's fair to say the majority, or at least many professors in English departments, in women's studies programs, and many of the identity studies programs all across the humanities, certainly in the social sciences as well, what they really do feel, but may not feel emboldened to actually articulate. This woman, I suspect, emboldened by all of the, the rhetoric that's been coming out of universities lately in support of Black Lives Matter and how we have to do so much more for marginalized students. And we're going to completely rethink the supposedly systemic racism that is permeated all throughout institutions of higher education. You know, all of that, I think, emboldened her to put this statement in her course outline. And the fact that Iowa State University has quickly come forward to say, actually, no, students do have free speech rights and don't worry about it, and this has now been removed, is very little comfort to me or the majority of students who are attending universities today who know that this is standard. And this is how English professors, women's studies professors, many humanities professors, this is how they actually think about conservative students, non-leftist students, Christian students, anybody who dissents from the far left orthodoxy. What they really believe is that they should be made to shut up because they don't believe that it's possible. Can you hear all that ringing on your end that's going on my computer? I've got these pop-ups coming up that are just driving me crazy, but if you can't hear them, that's good.
I'm not hearing any ringing, but I can say to audience members, put in the comments if you're hearing a ringing or a distraction thing.
I've suddenly got a million pop-ups coming up on my computer and I don't know how to get rid of them. But anyway.
After the show, we can talk about that. We can get rid of all of your pop-ups.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Thank you. Anyway, but you know, the reason this is a story is because it is standard. This is the way these professors think. This woman, for whatever ill-advised reason, thought she could actually state it outright. But this is the way these people actually do think. They believe that it is not possible to present a pro-life position that isn't, repugnant on its face and shouldn't be simply disallowed in all polite company. They don't think it is possible to make an argument against Black Lives Matter that isn't, a gutter racist kind of argument, and that proves that you are yourself a gutter racist, somebody who should be, completely prevented from having a point of view that you can express in the public sphere. This is what they really believe. And this is standard. This has been the case for at least 20 years. When I was a teaching assistant, this was already openly talked about in discussions. How can we ward off those disgusting evangelicals, for instance, or any conservatives? How can we prevent them from going on, nattering on with their inane, repugnant ideas? And so this isn't a slip, or it is a slip, but what it reveals is the very deep-seated bigotry and the idea that the role of the professor is indeed to judge students on their ideological positions. It's that bald and that blatant. I can't hear you, Steve.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes, I do now. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my fault. No, when you were talking about that, and you're mentioning the pro-life position, because really even pro-life people should be upset at some of the developments in abortion law, because they're actually talking about abortion legality up to the second before birth,
or even after birth.
And even after birth, yeah. In fact, there was a philosophical position put forward years ago for up to 2 years after birth, that you should be a woman should be legally allowed to abort the kid.
Yeah, I mean it's yes, this is astounding.
They don't want these students to be able to even make an argument against that.
No, I know. I mean, this is amazing. There are huge arguments in the United States. In Canada, we don't have any arguments about them because it has already been determined to be off limits. Nobody discusses abortion or the legality or ethics of abortion at any point. I mean, there are no laws against abortion in Canada at all. In the United States, at least, there are still debates about whether, if in the process of the abortion, the child somehow manages to survive, and whether in that case it should be killed after birth. I mean, it really is. This is not about a little blob of cells being antiseptically kind of got rid of. We're talking about children who are viable outside the womb, fully developed. They've got the heart beating. They've got all their organs. They are capable of feeling pain. They're capable of living as human beings. Clearly, they are human beings. They're just inside the womb. We're talking about killing them and making that it off limits to even discuss that. So yeah, this is, and it's ridiculous. It shows the level of ideological possession and the crudity of this woman's thought that she decided to say that you couldn't take a position that, I think she said, has at its base the idea that other people do not enjoy the same human rights that you enjoy.
Yeah.
She thinks this covers all of these issues. Well, abortion is clearly the one case where if you are pro-life, you are alleging that an unborn child is a human being who has the right to life. That is the argument. All she's thinking about, she doesn't think about a baby, an unborn baby, as a living human being with rights. All she's thinking about is the woman's rights. But I mean, it's crazy. And the drive to collectivize, to imagine that if you fit into a certain identity group, you can't possibly think outside the terms that have been allotted to you. If you're a woman, you can't possibly be pro-life because that means you're denying women rights. So she imagines it could only be men who could take a pro-life position, thereby denying women the right they enjoy to whatever, to their bodily autonomy, supposedly, which men don't have anyway, but never mind that. She imagines that it's not possible for a gay person to oppose gay marriage. She imagines it's not possible for a Black student to be opposed to Black Lives Matter. You know, she's that crude and simplistic and reductive in her thinking about students and about the possible arguments and positions that they might hold. I mean, this is a scary woman. You can see the reductiveness in her writing and the way she presents herself in her course outline. And you can also see that she can't even articulate her own positions very clearly. There are lots of places in that outline where it's not clear exactly what she means, and she can't say what she means very clearly. And that's the whole point of this course, supposedly, is to teach people how to articulate their ideas effectively.
And right out of the gate, she is denying equal space in her claim that you can't argue that position right away. So it's a self-contradictory claim right out of the gate. Yeah. And another thing, I saw you engage someone in the conversation around scrapping the universities altogether outside of the hard sciences and medicine and so on. And we've been talking about this from time to time. We've mentioned that. I don't see the value in pushing forward as authoritative thinkers people who are this stupid. And I have to call it stupid because the errors in her logic should be visible to somebody entering high school. High school, and yet,
oh, sure. I mean, and they would be to any young, very young person, you know, any grade 8 who had been taught to think at all, they would be evident. So they would have really nothing to learn from this person who doesn't write well and who thinks that her role in the classroom is to judge students' ideological positions. I mean, that to me, that is just it's wrong in every way. And there. I mean, I was engaging with one person who said, well, she shouldn't be fired for this, but then it ended up that we kind of agree that this is a firing offense. Perhaps she should be disciplined and told that she must never do this again. I mean, it's still very worrisome that someone this bigoted is, you know, someone so confirmed in her self-righteous bigotry is in the classroom. And the thought that she could ever judge anyone in an impartial manner, which is indeed a challenge, but she isn't even somebody who believes it's useful to try to be impartial. So this is, in my opinion, is not somebody who should be in a classroom at all. She's incapable of teaching.
I can't disagree with that at all. And your main point here, I think that one of the more important points is that this is the norm. We have to face the fact that anyone in her circle, including the humanities, who in fact argues against her position will be shunned by the entire faculty, may be run off campus besides. That's how bad our university systems have become today.
I will bet that she is not being disciplined in any way. I'd be very surprised if anyone spoke to her sternly about this. I think what probably happened was somebody spoke to her and said, look, you can't do this. But with the nudge, nudge, wink, wink, we all know that, you know, this is very honorable. This is commendable. Your desire that no one ever speak against Black Lives Matter or against
stunning and brave, right?
Yeah,
stunning and brave.
But you can't say it. You can't say it. And the change that this represents from the ideal of the university is so profound that it can't be overstressed. I mean, we're now used to it, that this is what universities are like. It wasn't always like this, and it doesn't have to be like this. It is possible to make the university into what one of my colleagues at University of Ottawa actually called, without any irony, a sacred space, or we could say a safe space, where everything is pretty much on the table, where we simply agree that this is not about judging people's positions, but this is about, in the case of a writing class, a rhetoric class, this is about actually assessing rationally and logically what kinds of arguments work and what kinds of arguments don't work, and allowing students, like you do in a debating society, allowing students to try out different positions, never with the assumption that you have to stand behind that position or that represents you in any sort of absolute way. I mean, that's what debating is all about. You're forced to debate positions that you don't necessarily agree with, that you might even find repulsive, and that's really useful. And to free students into a space where they can try on arguments and where they can have discussions about why a certain argument fails, or why this argument is better than another, why this kind of evidence doesn't actually prove the point, or why these sorts of examples are or are not particularly powerful, and the different levels on which you make an argument and how you appeal to people, how you persuade them, and how that can be dangerous actually if you're appealing primarily through emotion rather than through reason. You know, all those kinds of discussions. That is a wonderful thing if you can do that. But to start from the beginning to say, if you other anyone in our discussions, if you intentionally other anyone, you're going to be out. She's paralyzing her students' ability, therefore, to properly think and certainly to begin to express themselves with any kind of honesty or intellectual rigor. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and what you described there that we should be able to get to, that is really what the universities, I think, used to be, and the basis, what the ideas from which they were founded. Aren't there Latin phrases that are mottos of universities that actually, in fact, explicitly have that phrase in it?
Which phrase?
Me, I remember. So a phrase to the effect of the pursuit of truth.
Pursuit of truth. Certainly, yeah. I can't think of one now, but though I mean that was,
but and the pursuit of truth was the original, like the reason for being of a university, not the spreading of ideologies.
Ideology. No, absolutely, it was, and that was still claimed as the purpose of the university until quite recently, although it hasn't actually been. If you looked at university statements of their objective, their sort of charter statements, you often saw the pursuit of truth sitting alongside the pursuit of other objections, such as diversity and inclusion, and those kinds of things. And the problem is that those are two opposing ideologies. They can't work together, and social justice will always trump the pursuit of truth. And yeah, it's really too bad. And there's some people in the comments to the video saying, this has been a problem at universities for many, many decades. Going even way back to the 1950s earlier. And that may well be true, but it is, when I was a student in the early 1980s, certainly these ideologies already existed within the university. They were there and within the walls of the classroom, but I was not aware in the way that most students are today. I was not aware that my professors held political views that they were at all interested in imposing on their students. That just wasn't the sense I got in the class. I thought, we read books and we tried to dispassionately discuss what the ideas were. I mean, it's hard enough to just learn what's in the books, to understand what's really there. Let alone to be told what your position should be on those books. So, and that was the case in the early 80s, but it's all changed now.
Well, something came to mind as you were speaking, that in fact, we will always be fighting to reveal the truth, and there will always be an ideological battle
of course
in every open university. The difference today, because I'm not suggesting that there was a pure past that we've lost, an Eden of intellectuality. There never was that. But what there was the right to engage battle, and a battle of ideas. Now, what we're seeing today is that there's an ideological purity that's taken root, and they are destroying even the right to engage in the battle.
That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
And universities we've talked about before are the battleground. They're the Colosseum of battle of ideas, and that's what they should be. And so that is what we've lost. There's always been ideological purity trying to get in there and corrupt it, corrupt the
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, but at its best, you're absolutely right, and many of those who would oppose me would say that to pretend that you're approaching any subject from a non-ideological perspective is itself ideological, and it's a kind of false consciousness that you're not aware of your ideology. So it's even worse in a way, because you would bring unconscious biases. And that's, to some extent, yes. And especially if you allege that one has unconscious biases, it's impossible to claim that you don't, because they're unconscious, so you wouldn't be aware of them. But it is ridiculous to pretend that embracing conscious biases and imposing them on your students is superior to attempting to be non-biased. And everybody should be making the attempt. And it is possible. It really is. It requires an imaginative leap. It requires a lot of work. But once you do it, it's actually incredibly freeing. And it's freeing for the students as well as for the professor to say, okay, this is a space where we're going to talk about arguments. And I don't care what argument you make. I'm going to suspend my judgment about it in terms of its content, and you are too. And instead, we're going to talk about, we're going to try out arguments, and we're going to talk about how arguments work or don't work. That's amazing. And to have that kind of discussion in a class where nobody is taking things personally, you suspend that, you leave your identities at the door. You leave your passions and your commitments as best you can. Nobody can entirely, of course, but you do deliberately make the act of entering imaginatively into various kinds of positionalities, as the postmodernists would say. That's a wonderful and really useful, empowering, to use that word, experience for students and for the teacher. And a lot can get done in that kind of a classroom. Nothing is going to get done in this person's classroom. Can we look at her course outline, by the way, Steve? Do you have it there?
Let's do that. But I do want to respond to some of the things you said there. You made quite a lot of good points. So I'm going to take it back a little ways. The first purpose of, I already talked about that. But the argument that they made there that everybody has an ideological bias, that's a legitimate point. But it's in fact an argument in favor of opening up the battleground for the battle of ideas, because that's where your ideological bias will be revealed by your opponent, your ideological opponent. So that person seems to think that destroys the need or eliminates the need for open debate on any topic, but in fact it doesn't. It's actually one of the strongest arguments you can make in favor of every topic on the table and fight it out, because in fact every purveyor of ideas has an error and a viewpoint. But anyways, only the job of a judge, which in fact the teacher is in this situation, to be unbiased. The job of all the others in there is to be as biased as you can and put your argument as strongly as you can out and let somebody else try to destroy it. And that is how they're taught to think, not what to think. And this is why all these universities have become corrupt beyond redemption at this point, because they're not teaching how to think. They are teaching what to think in their own ideological perspective, and they're destroying young minds.
They sure are.
Opening them.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that is a way to do it too, where students argue for their positions. But, the thing is too, that a lot of students at age 19, 20, 21, even, all the way up to 25, don't really necessarily have entrenched positions. When I was that age, I don't know, I hadn't thought about a lot of these things at all, really. I was just having a good time, trying to get good grades, and trying to be popular or whatever. So I think the idea of saying that the university classroom is not going to be a space where you're going to be judged for what you believe, we're going to pretend that, we're just going to suspend all of that and allow people to try out any positions they want whatsoever. That is so helpful to students, to help them begin to explore what they might actually really believe, or at least help them to understand what the various positions are. They don't have to take a position. Why should a 21-year-old have to have a position on gay marriage or on anything at all, on illegal immigration? There are some students who are really interested in those issues. A lot of students aren't particularly political. And why should they have to be? This woman is suggesting that if you're not willing to take, to believe absolutely what she believes, that you're responsible for horrific verbal violence. And she makes that clear in her course outline. And it's a terrible trip to lay on a bunch of young people. That in itself, I think, is a kind of violence. It's disgusting.
Yeah, it should be cause for firing. She's basically telling them up front, and some of these kids might be thinking along the lines that she is telling them they'd be kicked out of class for. So those kids are then psychologically required to repress themselves, at least in that class.
Absolutely. It's terrible, and it's so ironic in that she pretends that she's this revolutionary. She's for justice. She's for the marginalized, the voiceless. It's complete nonsense.
Shutting up other people.
Shutting up other people, and the people
in the name of being for the voiceless.
Of course, and the people that she is shutting up are precisely the people that, in general, do not have a voice in the public sphere anyway. It's just ridiculous. How many people feel comfortable saying that they're against gay marriage in polite society today? Not very many.
All marriage.
Well,
never mind gay marriage. I'm against gay marriage on a humanitarian basis. I'm trying to save them from this horrible institution.
That's another argument altogether. But the positions that she is for are the dominant, intellectually respectable positions, certainly in urban areas. Certainly if you're looking at what the mainstream media tells us, the organs of elite culture, the generally acceptable positions, even amongst elite Republican figures, certainly amongst Democrats. So her positions are not radical in any way. They are entirely conventional. And so as she is saying to those few students in her class, those few evangelical Christians in the main, there may be some atheist pro-lifers around, and the few who are going against the grain with conservative viewpoints, or those few immigrant students, who were raised in a different, more conservative, more religiously conservative culture, perhaps. They already feel marginalized. They're already afraid to speak. They know that they'll be told they're hateful and bigots if they speak. And she's just confirming that. And she's telling anybody who has a center left or leftist position that not only are they correct, not only is their position the only possible humane position to have, but that they're totally within their rights to shut up other people who don't agree with them. Wow, talk about creating tolerance in the anti-oppressive classroom. It couldn't get more cliched and horrific.
And they have a long history of shutting people up, don't they? We've seen it at your talks. I'm just going to pause for 1 second here and acknowledge Harry Holbrook. Thank you so much for your support, Studio Brûlée, Harry. And Harry says, how dare you bring truth to academia? We stand on the shoulders of feminist emotions. True enough. It's all feminism, feminism all the time.
Yeah. Well, you can imagine what would happen. She didn't even mention, I think that's quite interesting, the three examples that she gave of impossible positions, or rather positions with which one is not allowed to argue: Black Lives Matter, gay marriage, abortion. She didn't even mention feminism, interestingly enough. But it's pretty clear.
That goes unsaid.
That's unsaid. You can imagine any man
dominates every single university right through to. Who would ever suggest that there's no feminism on a university campus.
Yeah, no, I mean,
It's
and
so
she
understood now.
is a declared feminist. She gave a talk at her university last fall in which she talked about her interest in monsters and monster theory. And she made it clear that women are the primary victims of othering. Ethnic minorities were a far distant second for her concern. So women are the primary victims. They are the ones who are othered, according to her. So you can imagine any man not willing to toe the feminist line, any man who wanted to talk about anything that was, pro masculine or had anything to do with any men's issue would be told also that he was a misogynist and denying women their rights. So this is a woman who is really incapable of she's incapable of recognizing the humanity of anybody who disagrees with her. I mean, that's the other irony. She's talking about making monsters out of people. And that's the whole point of her syllabus, is to say that if you don't agree with these positions, you are a kind of moral monster. Talk about lack of self-awareness.
No kidding. And what does the whole idea of toxic masculinity make of men, if not monsters?
Yeah.
I mean, and toxic is a term of a monster, to refer to a monster. And we have it blatantly pushed out and celebrated in the news, toxic masculinity. If anybody has been turned into a monster in this culture, it's men and their masculinity. And it's all coming from feminism, been pushing that for 60 years, as we all know well. You wanted to get to the, have a look at her course objective?
I'd like to, yeah. We don't have to read everything in it, but there are a few other points in it that I thought were quite shocking.
All right, let me pop it up here. I don't know if you can read any of this. Let me see if
it's pretty.
That doesn't really go any bigger, does it?
It doesn't go any bigger, eh?
Well, I can. If I expand it, it will go off the page on the side. But if you tell me exactly what you're looking for, I'll try to get that part on the screen here.
Well, I just wanted. Let's see now. I can read it. Maybe it's not worth going through. Oh, there's a couple things though. She mentions at the beginning, that she's taking the position that everything is an argument. So that's the basis of this course. And I think it's worth saying that this is a course called English 250. Now, I don't know that much about how this department operates, but I'm assuming that English 250 is a kind of standard course in writing and rhetoric. Rhetoric just means strategies of persuasion, strategies of argument. So this is not a specialized course for, an English major, say somebody who's doing a minor in women's studies. As far as I can understand. This is a course that is offered probably to students across the board. And it's supposed to be a course in writing. So the fact that she has turned it into a class on, othering and making monsters is really, the majority of students in the class are supposed to be there to learn writing skills, not to be ideologically indoctrinated. But there is a strange section there, the fourth paragraph down after the list. Let me read it.
Are you right after the list?
After the list of the types of assignments, the types of writing tasks they'll have to do. Right. The next one. I don't even know what this paragraph means, but it's quite interesting. Maybe you could read that one and maybe the next one too. This is where she talks about monsters. Okay.
As this class goes alongside WGS 201, it will view the concepts of rhetoric and arguments through the gaze of monster theory. Throughout history, monsters have served as the ultimate depiction of the other. Othering has long been one of the most effective tactics to isolate and control groups of people. This class will hopefully give you the tools to understand othering in day-to-day life, as well as combat it in your own communication. My God, when I read that, I think of the ways that feminists have turned men into monsters for 60 years, and she's completely, utterly unaware of it.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it amazing?
Incredible. It's actually stunningly incredible.
Yeah, the very thing that she thinks she is combating, the very thing is what her ideology her ideological companions have been promulgating for the last 50 years.
It's her tribe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and we are the men are the monsters.
Yeah.
And boy, have they ever tried hard to
have they ever?
men.
I mean, it's
unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. And if you look, actually, if you go back to that, the first sentence there, she says, as this class goes alongside, remarkable vagueness of expression. I don't know what that means, goes alongside. And notice the class that she mentions, WGS 201. I wonder what that is.
It sounds like another English gender studies.
Yeah, women's and gender studies. So I don't know whether this is a class that is in some way, it's not made clear whether this is a prerequisite for that course, or whether there is some kind of cross-listing, or whether this might be a special section of English 250 that has been specially set aside for students majoring in women's and gender studies, which might be why she felt, that she had the right to make all of these, interdictions against othering, etc. It's not clear from that. It's amazing to me that she can't even make it clear in her course syllabus. Goes alongside is not academic jargon.
No.
It's not clear at all.
But it does show that the entire class, we can assume, are in both classes, because she expects these. It leads me to believe that the whole class is probably also taking that other course.
Could well be. Yes, could well be, which is no excuse at all for assuming that anybody who takes a women's and gender studies course is already a committed, man-hating, rabid feminist and, couldn't possibly think their way through any of these complex arguments about Black Lives Matter or abortion. It's ridiculous, the assumption that therefore you could only possibly take one particular position on a variety of subjects, but that it is kind of interesting. But the more interesting thing is this business about monsters. So maybe you could just read that next paragraph as well.
Okay. Yep. What can monsters tell us about identity, cultural norms and ideals, art? We'll be looking at critical texts and theories about monsters, as well as popular culture and other creative works, depictions. Popular culture depictions. Our discussions will include such topics as what are monsters, what do zombies say about fear, how do film depictions of vampires change over time and why, and ultimately the most important question, what is a rhetoric of violence and how can an individual do something in the face of it?
I don't even, it's a jumble of ideas, but this is clearly a very dearly held idea of hers, this notion of the monster. There's an article that shows that she even gave a special Feminist Friday presentation at Iowa State University, in which she talked about monsters in popular culture and, what we can learn from studying monsters. But it's actually a key, a key issue where she's conflating two quite separate notions of othering and monsters that suggest to me that she will be utterly unable to explain these quite sophisticated ideas, probably way over the heads of most ordinary first or second year students who are supposed to be just learning how to write well, and who also have to grapple with all these abstruse ideas about monsters. But the fact is, she says that the monster is the ultimate other. And then she says they're going to look at all these examples of monsters in popular culture. But in fact, they're like monsters. In some ways, they are not the ultimate other. It depends. It completely depends on the depiction. Think of a famous monster in popular culture. The one that I first thought of was Frankenstein's monster, right? Everybody, even people who have not read Mary Shelley's novel or who have not watched any of the Frankenstein movies, everybody knows that something about that idea, that the scientist who attempts to create a human being out of dead body parts and creates this monster. in Mary Shelley's depiction, the monster is a really complex being, and people still argue, you know, more than 200 years later, about the meaning of her monster and how we're supposed to understand the monster, who is sometimes called the Frankenstein monster, although Frankenstein is actually the name of the scientist. And, you know, but the most basic thing one can say is that the monster is the target of her pity and of our pity as readers of that novel, because he wants to be human. And he develops the capacity to think and to feel, to think deeply about moral issues. He longs for a companion. That's ultimately his demand of his creator. Create me a companion. If you made me so ugly that I can't have anything to do with human society, I at least deserve my own, you know, somebody I can love and who will love me back. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. And there is no way that the monster created by Frankenstein in that novel is othered in that sense. It's the opposite. He is humanized. And so, and he is a monster with whom we are invited to identify, or at least to deeply empathize. So she seems to mix up the notion of othering, which is where you say that somebody is a horrible person, you know, and not one of my tribe. I'm going to put that person outside of the circle of the respectable. And the notion of the monster in much popular culture, where often the monster is the hero. Think of the Hunchback of Notre Dame.
I was thinking of that exact one. Yeah,
famous example. That's the person that we come to love. You know, that's the person with the great heart. This is the
Beauty
most
and the Beast.
moral. Yeah, you know, and that there's that tradition, which is at least as strong as any other tradition in which the monsters are bad. And she doesn't seem to even be able to clarify that or help think that through, that in popular culture, literary culture, there's a very strong tradition of readers, viewers being, you know, we love the outsider. Our heart goes out to the marginalized. How does that fit into her theory that othering is always a bad thing? Like, it's so incoherent that I don't think it would be workable as an idea in her class. And I don't think she has the sophistication, the intellectual ability to be able to deal with the slipperiness and the complexity of those kinds of concepts.
That's so excellent point there. Very excellent point.
I mean, this woman is not a thinker. That's the one thing that you would think would be, you know, the necessary condition to be an English professor. If you're teaching your students how to write, how to express ideas, how to grapple with ideas, how to make arguments, she can't do it.
Yeah, isn't that something? I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that's a really excellent point, that the monsters are very often the subject of
not always, sympathy. You know, not always,
no, but in the more,
often.
But in all, I think in all of the complex stories, you know, the stories that really probe into our psychic nature, you know, like Frankenstein is a very complex story in many ways. Those stories, the monster is, I can't think of one where the monster is the villain. The monster
she
is the villain.
Mentions vampires, and I think, you know, vampires are, well, that's too also complex. I didn't even think that through before I started saying it. I was going to say, usually the vampire is the other that produces horror, a response of horror in us, but not always either. You know, actually, there's a whole strain in modern vampire novels where we do identify with the vampires as well. And actually, that says something really interesting about Western culture. And it says something about Western culture's tendency to feel sympathy for outsiders and actually to make heroes or anti-heroes out of the ugly or the marginalized or, you know, the monstrous in some way, and to actually look to them as you know, figures of truth, figures of compassion, figures of superior morality. And I don't think there's any room in her theory for any kind of discussion of that. And it's certainly the same with, you know, I mean, with women and all sorts of identity categories who are seen as victims. It's the very fact that these people can make a claim to having been victimized that gives them power in our society. Why is that? Not because our society is horribly bigoted and mean towards women or various other marginalized groups, but actually because we do have a deep tradition, maybe because of the Judeo-Christian inheritance, maybe for various other reasons. We do have deep empathy for people who can make any kind of credible claim to having been victimized in the past or to being victimized in the present. These are the people that we want to embrace and pull inside. And we're viciously hostile to anybody who's seen as a perpetrator or a victimizer. So that turns her whole theory in a way on its head. And I think, there'd be all sorts of confusion in the minds of her students attempting to talk about these issues and always feeling stymied and hamstrung and nervous because she's already made it clear that anybody engaged in othering is going to be, if not kicked out of the class, certainly considered monstrous. So, there's going to be no possibility of talking through any of these issues because when you talk through them, you're likely to offend somebody or to say something a little bit wrong or to say as if, to seem as if you're minimizing somebody's suffering. And so, it's a recipe for disaster, and students are going to come out of that class feeling more confused than they began, but with a very strong sense that there are a whole series of subjects that they're not even allowed to talk about in an honest way in a search for truth. And that's really, wow, it's appalling.
Yeah, for sure. One of the ideas that came up a little while ago while you were talking was that that one of the uses or I think that the authors of monster stories are using the monster for. They're creating and using their monster as a mirror to reflect a culture's intolerance back onto itself. So in other words, the story then, the monster becomes that mirror for the culture to look at itself. Mm-hmm. And she's just not even able to connect, not able to get any sense of those kinds of ideas.
And what kind of a society is it that's interested in those stories? A society that wants to examine itself, that has deep compassion for those who suffer. Her point is the opposite, that we are a horrible, racist, bigoted society. That we've done this since day one, and we need to examine ourselves now. But what the point is that all these stories make is that actually the reverse is true, and that deep self-consciousness, empathy, and a desire to improve have been part of Western societies for a very long time.
And it reveals that what she's in fact doing is projection, because she as a feminist is in fact othering, monstering without the idea of reflection, but with the idea of demonizing. She is demonizing men through her feminism.
Men for sure, anybody with a conservative view, anybody who dissents in any way from her view. This is a very narrow ideology that she's putting forward, and she's very clear that if you dissent from it in any way, if you're skeptical about it, if you don't embrace it wholeheartedly, you are a monster. You're somebody who hurts others. You're somebody who engages in verbal violence, as she said. Wow. Can we just look back at that the list of phobias and isms that she said were prohibited in class discussion? Imagine being a 19-year-old and being presented with that and told that if you transgress any of those things consciously, you won't be allowed to stay in the class.
Right. Okay. So why don't I read the warning, the full warning out?
Read the warning.
Okay, because I'm not going to put it up on the screen, because that screen over there is hard to read where I put it up on. So I have it up here on the side. So this was included, folks, in the class description. By the way, I was just going to say what the class title was. I don't think we saw it before. Can I just put that up here before we do this? Here, I Googled it. This is what it says: written, oral, visual, and electronic composition.
You'd never know that from that description, would you?
No. But anyways, let me read this warning that she puts in her class course description. Any instances of othering that you participate in intentionally, bracket, racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, sorophobia, transphobia, classism, mocking of mental health issues, body shaming, etc., close quotes, in class are grounds for dismissal from the classroom. The same goes for any papers, projects. You cannot choose any topic that takes at its base that one side doesn't deserve the human basic rights as you do, i.e. no arguments against gay marriage, abortion, Black Lives Matter, etc. I take this seriously. All you can do is say, wow.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah. The lack of self-knowledge and self-reflection in that warning is unreal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really completely, I would say, there's so many things to say about it, but it's unnecessary. You could say, I used to say in my course syllabus that I wanted to have debate in the class, and that all questions, all discussion should be conducted in a civil manner. I think that would be, plenty enough. Like the idea that there are all sorts of students coming to class who just want to insult other students and mock them and make them feel bad is so far from the truth. Most students, they just don't want to say the wrong thing. Like the pressures, peer pressure, the desire to be liked and approved by one's companions, by one's peers, is so strong at this age that it's highly unlikely anybody is going to go out of their way to try to insult somebody else in the class. I taught for well over 20 years as a tenure track and tenured professor, and it just wasn't an issue. So to pretend that it is an issue, I mean, I found it was an issue trying to get students to talk. Most students are either too shy, too uncertain of their own ideas, or just too bored and not, they just want to get the grade and get out of there. They don't want to engage in debates and arguments about things. And this is a great way to destroy any student who has real intellectual curiosity and would actually like to explore ideas in a complex manner. If you're just towing the ideological party line, there isn't that much to talk about. So, it's an outrageous thing. And then the idea, like I said in my video, that somebody writing an essay for their professor, that's going to do verbal violence to somehow perform an act of verbal violence merely if one of the examples that I was going to use, what if she has an Arab student writing about gay marriage in Saudi Arabia? What's she going to say to him? It's just.
She certainly put the threat out there to shut down any possibility that anybody's going to honestly explore their own thoughts. Yeah. Now, if she had encouraged that argument, then she would have had a chance to engage with the errors, perhaps, of that person's argument. Someone against gay marriage, for instance. How can you convince somebody that they're wrong about gay marriage if you don't let them express the argument in the first place?
Of course,
you can't.
And again, I mean, I would say it's not a professor of rhetoric's job to convince anybody of anything.
Yeah,
it's just absolutely none of her business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
you made that really, really clear in the video. That it's she's supposed to view these things from the quality of the argumentation and the quality of the use of English or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. And basic rhetorical principles are that the the person who's doing the writing is not necessarily the I who speaks implicitly or explicitly in the essay. And she doesn't even seem to have figured that out. I mean, that's a basic precept of composition theory. It's
are they not teaching these basic precepts anymore? Have they just given up on the basics in university? How can she become a professor without understanding that?
I don't know. I mean, it's
how can she even graduate?
Yeah, it's complicated because a lot of people end up teaching writing who were never trained to teach writing, and there are usually opportunities to get some training. And I trained to learn how to teach writing specifically in summers. I had a job as a tutor when I was first an undergraduate and then a master's student, and I got intensive training in how to teach writing. But most people don't. And so a lot of people end up teaching writing who have MAs or PhDs in literary studies, which doesn't necessarily make you a writing teacher at all. So that may be part of what's going on here. I don't really know what her background is or how this department goes about teaching writing. But yeah, it doesn't matter though. Even if there were courses in pedagogy, writing pedagogy, they would have been taken over by leftist feminism anyway. And
maybe that's the problem.
They're all about now. All universities are about the alleged harm to vulnerable, marginalized students of hearing anything that might cause them, some kind of whatever to feel marginalized further or whatever. And the systemic violence that they experience every day, and all of this exaggerated rhetoric of victimization. So so she would feel perfectly justified in making all these interdictions against everything from homophobia to sorophobia, which was a new one for me. I learned something anyway. Sorophobia. I bet we're practicing it right now. What is it, Steve?
Well,
are you a sorophobe?
I don't know. I'm not a sorophobe, if I'm understanding sorophobia properly. I think it's like the fear of the sisterhood or something like this. Or
yeah, somebody mentioned that. That makes sense. I should have known that. Yeah.
I'm not if the sisterhood means feminism, then I'm not a sorophobe. I'm a anti-Soro.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
I'm going to pause here. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, phobia always is a really weird ism anyway, implying that you fear something, when one doesn't necessarily fear it. One is simply not in agreement with it in many cases.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe she's not using phobia in the right context there either. Yeah. I'll just acknowledge Sean Tower here. Thank you so much for your donation to Studio Brûlé, Sean. Really appreciate it. And Sean says, yes, it is supposed to be education, not indoctrination. And unfortunately, Sean, those days are long gone.
Yeah, they really are. That's the thing. What possessed this woman to think that was a appropriate thing to put in a course syllabus? She didn't just make that up out of nothing. That is from years of listening to her colleagues talk about how much they hate having to read conservative arguments, basically.
Janice, I want to ask you this question. Don't they have to get their course syllabus approved?
Yeah, probably. But
this was approved then.
Well, yeah, it's hard. That's complicated too. Because probably there's a bunch of rhetoric that she has to put on her course syllabus, and she would almost certainly have to submit the syllabi to somebody, and they'd be looked over by somebody. But it's probably not the person's top priority to go through reading every word of the course syllabus of dozens, if not maybe even 100, people that are offering courses. This is a pretty big school, Iowa State. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it was approved maybe, but that doesn't mean that anybody necessarily read it or even saw that.
So the approval process is a sham too, well, like the education process.
It's, people are busy. I mean, I don't even know maybe this was an online course because all the universities are in lockdown mode, right? And so some of the regular channels of approval might have been suspended. There might have been some kind of mix up over who was to read through the course syllabus. It's really hard to say. Yeah, it's hard to say. But I mean, there is no doubt that in general, her attitude towards students and towards her role as the chief ideologue in the classroom, that is widespread and widely accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
no question there, which leads us to the conclusion that we need to defund the universities and send that money to the police.
Yeah.
They need it.
Yeah, no kidding.
They need it. They're being beat up in the streets now by the criminals and thugs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they've been encouraged to the police, students, and all of those students who go on, graduate, and go into various professions have been encouraged that it's not an act of violence to respond to verbal violence with violence. I mean, you can see that right in the course syllabus when she talks about how do we respond as individuals to acts of verbal violence. Well, what people have learned is that you punch somebody in the face if they have committed an act of verbal violence. And that's what we're seeing in the streets. That doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from decades of this kind of indoctrination. Obviously, she's not personally responsible for the rioting in the streets, but she's part of what has made it possible for people to think that that's a righteous thing to do. And for many, many people in the general populace to think, oh, this is necessary, this is going to lead to something good, all that kind of stuff. These people have good intentions. Maybe they get a bit carried away and all that kind of thing. That all comes from this sort of self-righteous, I don't know what it is, demonizing of those who dissent. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. I guess we could go on and on, but probably that's enough.
We could go on 24/7. There's so many examples and topics of these feminist root destroying our culture. Yeah. And I always like to remind people that the term whiteness, which is referring to Western culture, is whiteness for a reason, because whiteness has a face on the street. And when you see white on the street and you're not white and whiteness is evil, what do? You beat it up or you kill it. That's why they're using the term whiteness, to incite violence, in my opinion. It's not an accident. If they really meant Western culture, they would have said Western culture. But they don't. I mean, Western culture doesn't have a face.
What does it mean to say that you want to destroy Western culture? I mean, my God, for what? What is going to be the result of that? I mean, that in itself is an astounding claim that we are hearing being overtly made. And yet people are okay with that. Okay, yeah, let's tear down all the statues. Let's wipe out history. Let's start all over again. That's never worked out well. And yet somehow we think it might this time.
Yeah, no, it's a disaster. And they don't have an alternative. And this is typical about these kinds of people. They want to complain. And the implication is that there is the implication of their complaining about this culture is that if we just destroy it, there's a utopia that will just be right there behind it, Yeah. But they have no idea how to articulate it. Of course, it's nonsense.
Yeah. Well, the history of utopias is a history of massive cruelty and atrocity. So, yeah. Anyway,
one world government.
Yeah. Good to speak to you.
Great to talk to you too, and Janice. And I just want to, before we sign off, I acknowledge Harry Holbrook again. Generous donations to Studio Brûlé. Thank you, Harry. And Harry says, "Glad to see you both. Keep up the truth and wisdom." Thanks. Thank you so much, Harry. And thank you so much to all of our viewers and supporters and friends of Studio Brûlé. You make it worthwhile. At least somebody out there is listening to us, even though YouTube is trying to crush the voice of reason. Sure. Having said that, thank you to everyone for joining us, and look for us again, Coffee with Steve, and look for upcoming Fiamengo files coming weekly, perhaps. Ciao.
Ciao.